Rejoicing, rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea.
We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we meet Thee. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past, till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we meet Thee.
Thank you, Hobbs Waters, for that riveting dance interpretation to lift every voice and sing. Hobbs is a 14-year-old artist, dancer, and entrepreneur based in Portland, Oregon. Thank you. And we are so grateful that he and his choreography collaborator and sound editor, Kayla Banks, prepared the special dance for today's program. We'll see more of Hobbs at the end of today's program. Hello and welcome. I'm Lanisha DeBartoleben, President and CEO of the Northwest African American Museum. Thank you all for tuning in today. As we begin, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish people. We also honor the Coast Salish people of this region. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of a people who are still here, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. We are grateful for our African ancestors who survived the Ma'afa, the Middle Passage, who endured the violence of slavery and the indignity of racial oppression, who had the courage to pack up and head north and west to the Northwest, who blazed trails for us to be here and to be ourselves here. Here at the Northwest African American Museum, education is at the core of who we are and what we do. We advance justice and equity through education and programs like this. As part of this series, we have featured conversations with a wide variety of descendants of Black historical luminaries, such as the descendants of Ida B. Wells, Dred Scott, Solomon Northup, as well as William Grimes, Madam C.J. Walker, and others. And today, we welcome the descendant of W.E.B. Du Bois, his great grandson, Arthur McFarlane II, here with us from Denver, Colorado. Du Bois, born in 1868, was one of the most influential Black scholars and civil rights activists of all time. He lived a full and fruitful life in service to Black well-being, liberation, and first-class citizenship. He was the first African American to receive a PhD in history from Harvard University in 1895, authored the classic book, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903. Co-founded the NAACP in 1909, was editor of the most influential publication of the era, The Crisis magazine, from 1910 to 1934. He is one of the pillars of Pan-Africanism, and eventually he lived his last years in Ghana because the United States government refused to renew his passport for his return. He died in Ghana on August 27, 1963, one day before the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, at which Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would deliver his I Have a Dream vision for America. We are so fortunate to speak today about the life, the leadership, and the legacy of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois with his direct descendant. The organization that Du Bois helped to found and build, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, is co-presenting today's program with our museum. The NAACP has been winning civil rights battles for over a century, and we are thankful to partner with 8 branches from across the Northwest on today's program. The Seattle King County branch, Spokane branch, Tacoma branch, Bremerton branch, Snohomish branch, Portland, Oregon branch, Anchorage, Alaska branch, and Vancouver, Washington branch, along with the regional conference of the NAACP. And here to give opening remarks is Vice President of the Seattle King County NAACP, followed by remarks from the Vice President of the Alaska, Oregon, Washington State Area Conference of the NAACP. And later in today's program, we'll hear from representatives of a few other local NAACP branches. Thank you, and we'll be right back.
My name is Claude Burfeck, and I am Vice President of the Seattle King County NAACP. We're here today to discuss the National NAACP and its founding, one of its founding fathers. As you know, the NAACP is one of the oldest civil rights organizations, which was founded on February 12th, 1909. But we don't want to dwell on that. What I want to say is that what transpired back then is still existing today. When we talk about education, we talk about jobs, we talk about voter suppression, all of this is what transpired back then. And I guess we can call that discrimination against Black folks. It was founded because of how Black folks were treated back then, the lynchings, the burning of houses, total discrimination. And like I said, what transpired then is happening today, and we still, the NAACP, still need to continue the fight against racism, inequality, and discrimination. Thank you.
Now is the accepted time, not tomorrow, not some more convenient season. It is today that our best work can be done, and not for some future day or future year. It's today that we fit ourselves for the greater usefulness of tomorrow. Today is the seed time. Now are the hours of work, and tomorrow comes the harvest and playtime. My name is Shalee Anderson. I am the Vice President of the nation's oldest and boldest, the biggest, the baddest civil rights organization in the nation, the one and only NAACP. And those were the words of our dear brother, the co-founder of the NAACP, no one other than the W.E.B. DuBois, who had the vision and the leadership to understand how we shift and move through time. And because of his vision and leadership, we have an organization that was founded in 1909 and is still here today, fighting the fight of 2021 as we work, as we prepare for today, so we can harvest for tomorrow. NAACP is pleased to share this stage with his descendant, Brother McFarlane. Thank you so much for sharing your words with Seattle and Washington State. Because of your legendary grandfather and the wisdom that he shared with this nation, we are able to prepare for this harvest and move through time. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Claude Burfect of the Seattle King County NAACP and Shalee Anderson of the Alaska, Oregon, Washington State Area Conference of the NAACP. We appreciate your message and your mission. Today's moderator, Kiantha Duncan, embodies the commitment to scholarship, service, and informed activism that W.E.B. Du Bois exemplified. Ms. Duncan is a mobilizer and president of the Spokane, Washington Branch NAACP. She is highly sought after for her leadership, her commitment to community, and her facilitation of impactful programs and projects. She is a seasoned leader and has dedicated her career to supporting marginalized and disproportionately impacted communities. She is an influencer, a former newspaper columnist, author, and former radio personality. Ms. Duncan inspires and challenges audiences to repurpose negative experiences for good. Her passion is to help others actualize their potential, purpose, and connectedness through the art of conversation. We are so grateful to have Ms. Duncan here to moderate today's conversation with our descendant. I am turning it over now to Ms. Duncan. You all please enjoy, be informed, and be inspired from today's conversation. Thank you.
Hello, 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 and welcome. Thank you all for tuning in to what I promise to be a soulful conversation as part of the Descendants Series with the Northwest African American Museum. My name is Kiantha, and I am so honored to share space and time today with Mr. Arthur McFarlane II, the great grandson of the scholar, the activist, and co-founder of the NAACP, Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Arthur, thank you so much for joining me today. And I must ask, in the midst of this very challenging time where our world is sort of upside down due to the impact of COVID-19 and its pandemic across our world, how are you faring during this time?
Hi, Kiantha. It's so nice to be with you this afternoon, and my appreciation to Lanisha and to Shalee for their words. Your question is a good one. I think I am, like most people, coping, finding the best coping skills that I can to get me through working at home and avoiding the COVID-19 and really putting my skills together as a public health official. I'd spent 25 years working in public health to try to guide some of the discussions and some of the ways in which we are working with this pandemic. But thank you for asking. How are you doing?
You know, listen, I'm on cloud 9 today. If there is a cloud 10, I'm on 10 because I am so excited at the opportunity to speak with you and to learn more about your grandfather, but to learn it through the eyes of a great grandson. I am a person who, my grandmother was very influential in my life. And although she didn't do things that changed the world in the way that your grandfather did, I think of her every single day. And so for you, it is, I'm sure, a very large responsibility to carry all that your grandfather has done for African Americans across, the globe. So thank you for that. So knowing what you know about your grandpa, and because you and I have spoken, I know that you refer to your grandfather as grandpa.
I do.
Knowing what you know about grandpa as a thought leader, him as an activist and a visionary, what do you think his thoughts would be around the disproportionate impact of this virus on the African American community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I try not to put myself in Grandpa's shoes because he was way smarter than me. just saying. But in terms of his activism around so many different issues, I am sure he would be calling out the United States government and state governments and public health officials across this country and asking them the question, why is it that there is this disproportionate impact? And I think the answer is there in front of all of us, right? It really revolves around the social determinants of health. It revolves around economics. It revolves around racial injustice in the past, social injustice in the past. All of those things come into play to create this disproportionate impact that we see currently. Would he be surprised by the disproportionate impact? He would not be surprised. The question just would become, what would the words be that he would wrap around his displeasure?
Yes. And I would give $1 million to hear those.
You and
So
me both.
yes. So this is the thing that I'm wondering. I know that your grandpa was someone who not only shed the light of responsibility on the government, on the institutions of power, but he also required that community step up
Yes.
and take responsibility as well. So what do you think he might have to say to our communities, people who are maybe struggling with how to move through this pandemic, those who might be on the fence around vaccinations or treatment, or their belief and understanding around not just the COVID virus, but also the Delta variant of the virus? What do you think he'd say?
Well, he was a man of science, right? He was the first person to bring scientific sociology to bear on some of the questions that we're talking about. I think he would bring the science to bear and ask people, implore people to be vaccinated, to look at the different things that they can do in their community to help one another to survive this pandemic, to really build and strengthen during a difficult time some of the infrastructure and ways in which we can be supportive of one another. My work in social determinants of health really shows that there is a lot to be said for the non-governmental agencies, the small organizations within a community, doing the work that really supports the community in many ways. Churches was something that he focused a lot of attention on in his study and his work, really working with other kinds of small organizations within the community, whether it was fraternities and sororities, or it was the local food bank. I think those are the kinds of things he would look at and he would say, how can we strengthen them in the face of this pandemic so that we are better supported within our community?
Wonderful. So I know that you are going to be sharing some information with us and sharing some photos that are never before seen photos. And you didn't even let me see them ahead of time. So I'm super excited about that. I was expressing in conversation to one of the reporters of our local newspaper, the Spokesman Review, who also this person happens to write for the Black Lens as well, which is our Black newspaper here in Eastern Washington. And I was expressing that your grandfather, your great grandfather, Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois, was a psychic of the worst kind, a psychic of the worst kind, because somehow he knew that 200 years later, 109 years later, we would still be in the need of an organization like the NAACP. So that is a level of foresight that he had along with the other founders. But I wonder for you, have you considered where we might fare on the scale of, have we made progress? Are we making progress? And what might your grandfather think about that?
That's a really interesting title that you have given him. I'll have to steal that at some point. I really think that he was so far ahead of his time in his thinking that in many ways we are just catching up. In many ways, we are just applying some of his thoughts. In many ways, we are just understanding clearly what he really meant when he said some of the things that he said. I think he would be looking at what we've done and understand clearly, and I really mean that, I use that word very intentionally, very clearly, that we have not achieved everything that we might have achieved, but we have achieved a great deal. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in my remarks, but he gave me some advice when I was 3 months old. He said, do work that the world needs to have done and work that you enjoy doing. But part of that advice was also to say that there isn't much of a difference between 100 years and 1,000 years, and that we have to be patient, and that we have to look forward, and we have to be willing to keep our shoulder to the wheel. He told me that it would not change as quickly as I wanted it to change. He said that the only inherent reward that I would have would be having my hand on the wheel. And it said those words to me when he was 90 years old. So we'll talk a little bit about what parts of his life he went through to get to 90. But you can imagine that the wisdom that went behind those words to a little boy, a 3-month-old young man, and to have those words still echo in my mind, almost 63 years later, they were profound. They had a profound impact on me. And I share them with people to say, the work we're doing is important work. Like Shalee was saying earlier, we must do this work. We must do it because it is important work to do, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. And he gave us his work, his words for future generations.
Now tell me about the memories. So you remembered that particular thing, but he was saying that to you in his 90s. What are some of your very first memories of your great-grandfather?
Well, I was lucky. He was giving me that advice when he was speaking to a rather large audience at his 90th birthday party in Roosevelt Hotel in New York City. And so because of that, there were reporters there and people to write things down. He also wrote those words down in his posthumously published autobiography. And so I have the joy of getting the opportunity to go back and reread them, rethink about them, recommit myself to them, re-understand what it is that I'm supposed to do in my own mind, not just in Grandpa's mind, but in my own mind. And I think it's really clear for me that as I look back on those words and I play those words forward in my mind, I can see where some of the answers lie. It's almost like someone's shining a little flashlight on the question, and then moving that flashlight over towards a prospective answer. He gives me thought, he gives me pause, he makes me look harder at the things that are in front of me. And even though, as you were alluding to just a minute ago, it is kind of a larger burden, it is also an incredible gift because it has given me the kind of confidence that it takes to say, one person does indeed change the world. He changed the world as we know it. I know that. I know that from looking at his work and from listening to his words. And I know that that can just as well be else.
Well, you're also changing the world. So let's not get that misunderstood. Yes, he changed the world, absolutely. But you are one of his descendants, and you continue to change the world in having conversations like these and sharing your grandfather's work, sharing all of the behind the scenes information that you have, all of the lessons, again, all of the psychic understandings that he had. So you too are changing the world. And I want you to know that as well, because this would not be possible, today's conversation, without you being here. So you too are
I appreciate that. I try to do my best.
absolutely. Now, I've been thinking about this for quite a few days. And the number one thing that I want to know is, tell me, I'm interested in the juxtaposition of activism today and activism in the time of W.E.B. Du Bois. What is the difference now? And what are we using? What ways are we using the work that he invested in and and structures that he created? How are we using that in activism today?
Very insightful question. And the answer is profound and important. And what I mean by that is, what we see as activism today happens very quickly. The news cycle is not 24 hours, it's not 12 hours, it's not 6 hours, it's minutes in certain cases. And when you think back, and when I get into my remarks too, my presentation, I'll try to take people back to that time, back to 1868, back to 1870, back to 1899 to 1900 to 1903, and remind us of what the technology was like then. When you think about some of the words that Shalee was talking about in relationship to the NAACP being this organization that was started in 1909 and still is going strong, and he was the editor of the Crisis magazine, as Lanisha mentioned. It really was that the Crisis magazine that he was editing, the words that he was producing, were handed from person to person to person to person, 9, 10, 11, 12 times, because people couldn't always afford the 10 cents that it cost to buy it themselves. So they would share it. That is not a concept that we have today. We almost universally have a phone in our hand, in our pocket, often in our hands, 2 at a time, at my friends, and we're getting information very, very quickly. That is what I would say is the real change between activism then and activism now, is I can communicate the need for a particular activist moment to happen much more quickly than Grandpa ever could have during his time. And I can marshal people to that moment much more easily and much more comprehensively than he could have in his day. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? There's, everything is a double-edged sword. So I would say for us as activists today, we have to utilize that sword in a way that best meets the needs of our communities. And we have to realize and understand that in wielding that sword, we are in fact wielding a weapon that can come back and bite us in many ways too. So we have to be very careful, use our words, use our power, use our community in ways that really raises those things up.
I think you're very, very wise to say that we have information available to us at not just a different speed, but we're able to share so many things so far out. And imagining if the Crisis magazine at that time, which, they did the old-fashioned way, imagining if that was easily able to put on a social media or Facebook or Instagram or something like that, where we would disseminate the information so quickly and be able to call for action so quickly. So to me, it tells us that we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to use technology to our advantage and to think about ways of incorporating the standard, maybe historical ways of activism into the work that we're doing today and the ways in which we're doing it.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Which goes back to the responsibility is on us.
That's
it
right.
Goes back to that, the responsibility is on us.
Yeah, there is no doubt that it is.
Yes. I am wanting to move us into your presentation because, as I mentioned, I'm just beyond excited and I want to watch this as if I was home watching it. I want to see the photos. I want to hear the narratives, hear your stories. And we again are so grateful that you are sharing with us this day. And we look forward to our learning, and I will have lots of questions when you're done. So
All right.
Take it away.
I appreciate that. And I think that one of the things that I say to people all the time is that when I do these presentations for folks, and I do them in person and virtually all over the world, I really do come away and learn things myself. I learn things from the questions that people ask and the perspectives that they take around Grandpa's work and the things that I am interpreting, because I am an interpreter. I am not W.E.B. Du Bois. I am his great grandson. I'm not even a Du Bois scholar. There are probably, dozens of people out there who know his work much more clearly and have studied it much more carefully than I have. I represent someone who has maybe a unique perspective, however. So I'm going to share a bit of that perspective here in the next 30, 35 minutes and look forward to the questions that folks have for me at the end. One of the things that I think is really important for us to understand about Grandpa is that we are looking at him from the perspective of time, right? We are looking at him from the 21st century when in fact he was someone who was born in 1868. So I'd like to start out the presentation by giving you a quote from Du Bois. I really appreciated Shali's quote from Grandpa. And here is yet another that I think really reflects some of the work that we're looking at today. We see states and communities all over the country in many ways disempowering and trying to disenfranchise people, to take away that ability to use the power of the ballot in a way that is important. And as Grandpa says here, what would happen to us? What would save us from this second slavery? Well, it is the ballot, and we need to use it in defense of ourselves. Like I mentioned earlier, I want to put people into a temporal context, to take people back in time and remind them of some of the contemporaries of Grandpa, people who were born around and about the same time that he was born. Now, before anyone sends me a chat and tells me, why is there a list of men in front of me? Let us go to the next slide so we understand that there were important women who were also born and also doing their work in the same time period as Grandpa was doing his. Other things that were going on, setting that stage, the Emancipation Proclamation 5 years before Grandpa is born. So you see some of the other things that were going on. The country was not the way we see it today. We were a different place. We were a different country. There were different situations. And this will become a little bit more obvious a little later when I talk about some of the differences that I saw in between the work that Grandpa was doing and the work that Booker T. Washington was doing, and how those two men were different and how they brought different skills and different things to the table as leaders. This is a picture of my great-grandfather and his mother, Mary Sylvania Burkhart. Grandpa's mom dies when he is 17 years old, just before he leaves to go to Fisk University. This is a photograph of his dad in his Civil War uniform. My great-grandfather went back and looked at his family background all the way back as far as he could go, many generations. And it became clear that we had members of our family that had in fact fought in the Revolutionary War. So it is in honor of the work and the service that my great-grandfather gave to this country that I show you a picture of him in his Civil War uniform. This is a picture I took. The home that you see there in the background is not the home that Du Bois lived in as a boy. That home, the foundation of that home is in fact on the other side of that building. The University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is where many of the pictures that you'll be seeing today comes from their website, owns a piece of the property that the Boyhood home site is on. It is in fact an archaeological site that the university is using to get a clearer understanding of what it was like to live as an African-American in Southwest Massachusetts around the time of Du Bois's birth, and the generations that lived on that site. The Black Burkharts were what they were called. What was their life like? What was their existence there in that part of the world like? I took some other pictures walking around and driving around different parts of Great Barrington in the time that I was there. This is a marker that shows another home site, another place that Grandpa lived in Great Barrington, which is a very small town, but beautiful and wonderful. Grandpa talks about growing up on the Housatonic River many times. He alludes to it both in his poetry as well as in his prose and in the work that he was doing. He fell in love with rivers, and he celebrated rivers wherever he went. And in fact, one of the few Langston Hughes poems that Langston actually dedicated to an individual is a poem dedicated to my great-grandfather that's called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. There's a river walk near the Housatonic, or on the Housatonic there, that depicts Grandpa's life. That little area that I mentioned earlier where the university owns some property, they've put a little walk that has similar kinds of signs that walk through Grandpa's life and walk through some of the major aspects of his life. Grandpa grew up in a very small town, as I mentioned. This is his entire high school graduating class. He's the guy on the left-hand side, if you didn't really pull that out. He grew up in this town that came to appreciate his intelligence, came to appreciate his brilliance. He was a stringer. He wrote articles for some of the New York and Boston newspapers, primarily telling them about what life was like in Great Barrington, what life was like in that part of the United States. The folks there saw his intelligence and clearly felt like it was important for him to continue forward. And so it was, in fact, after his mother died, that some of the members of the town gathered money together to allow him to go to Fisk University. So he leaves Great Barrington, he goes to Fisk, and if you read his autobiographies, one of any of them, particularly 4 or 5 that he's written, he talks about this transition from Great Barrington, a predominantly white, but very liberal and open small town in Massachusetts, to Nashville, Tennessee, where he goes to Fisk, a predominantly African-American town, a predominantly African-American school, and experiences, as he calls them, the hues, the differing hues of Black people. He doesn't have a lot of money, and so he has to work. And the work that he does is to go out from Nashville, out from the university proper, and goes out into small schools, small elementary, high schools, and really tries to teach the young people there and earns a few dollars doing that. Well, of course, this is 1888. It's before the automobile, so he walks places. And he walks among the former slaves. He walks among them in their fields and in the work that they are doing. And so when you go to look at Souls of Black Folk and you see the words and the music at the beginning of the chapters, you see some of the words and some of the music that he was hearing from those former slaves. He earns a bachelor's degree in 1888 from Fisk. He goes on then to Harvard. Harvard does not recognize his bachelor's degree from Fisk, so he goes into Harvard as a junior. He has to re-earn his bachelor's degree and then goes on to become the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard. This is a picture from his commencement when he actually gets his bachelor's degree. So this is before he gets his master's degree, or master's and PhD. And he gives a speech, and you know, I have a lot of interesting questions to ask my great-grandfather when I meet with him again. And one of the questions is, why did you choose to poke your finger in the eye of the administration at Harvard University and do a talk about Jefferson Davis, the former Confederate president, as part of your bachelor's degree graduation? So, you know, I think, as I've said to many audiences, I think this was the time that Harvard had the opportunity to kick him out, send him away, and say, you know, you maybe don't fit here so well. But they didn't, and he went on to finish his PhD at Harvard. He admits that he grudgingly accepted a PhD from Harvard because he spends 2 years as part of this time before he earns his PhD at the University of Berlin. And he actually is within a year of finishing the work that he would have needed to do to get a PhD from there. And that was considered to be the greatest university on the planet at the time. And so Harvard was sort of a second best, and he accepts his PhD from Harvard, and he goes on to do the work that we'll be talking about here. His PhD is entitled Suppression of the African Slave Trade. And for many years, it was considered to be the best work describing the transatlantic slave trade of people coming to the United States, and coming not just to the United States, but coming, as he mentions here, to the British West Indies and to South America and to other parts of this part of the world from Africa. It's important for us to understand that slavery here in the United States was fundamentally different from slavery in many other parts of the world. People were owned, and the ownership of people gave the owners a kind of control that we don't see in other versions of slavery around the world often enough. And that is something that we will talk a little bit about later, as it forms the foundation for the relationship between Black people and this country. I mentioned earlier Booker T. Washington. This is a picture of Booker in 1895 when he gives his famous speech at the Cotton Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia, what many people call the Atlanta Compromise speech. I have a lot of respect for Booker T. Washington because he was a product of a different system than my great-grandfather was. My great-grandfather was a product of free Black people in a community that was clearly supportive of him and of his mother and of his family. I didn't mention, but his father left, Grandpa's father left early on in his life. He didn't know his father. And so it was just him and his mom, and his community supported him. He supported his mother with work. And when she was disabled with a stroke, they supported her with money, and the community was there for Grandpa when it came time for him to go away to Fisk. And I can't say that that would have been the case for Booker Washington in his life growing up. He grew up as a slave, and he grew up in a slave system with that slave mentality. And it really is quite clear to me when I look at the differences between the two men, like you see here on this screen, that there is a huge difference between these two backgrounds. One born in the South, one born in the North, one born in slavery, one born free. Their backgrounds beyond that don't change or aren't very different, other than that bottom line when you get to the point where you see that Booker Washington died at a relatively young age of 59, and Grandpa went on to live to be 95 years old. Booker Washington spent most of his life in the South, spent most of his life near or about Tuskegee, Alabama, whereas Grandpa spent a lot of his life traveling around the world and getting that different perspective and participating in things at a different level. It is the clash between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington around the education of the Negro, as it was prescribed in those days, or described in those days, I think that really forms the basis for Black people evolving into what we see today. If you go and you listen to or you read The Souls of Black Folk, one of the quotes that you will hear is the one about Tunis. It really is being born a Negro and being born an American that is part and parcel of what makes it difficult for us as African Americans in the United States to go forward. And I think a big part of what allowed Grandpa to talk about that, to say those words, to write those words, and to lead in a different direction than Washington went, is this background of being born free in the North. So Kiantha, here you have it. I want to just point out that this photograph that you see on the screen right now is a photograph that I'm using for the first time in my presentation. And it is a photograph of two rings, as pretty obvious, but it's maybe not the two rings that you would expect. When I first came into possession of these rings, I had imagined that they were the wedding rings of my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, Nina. Grandpa marries Nina Gomer in 1896. He gets engaged to her in 1895, and he meets Nina at Wilberforce. So let me say that as Grandpa is finishing his PhD, he's doing what any young man of his age would do. He's looking for a job. And as it turns out, Wilberforce in Ohio is the first to come along and offer him a job that is acceptable. He accepts their offer and he moves to Ohio. I think it's a few months later, he actually gets an offer from Tuskegee Institute from Booker T. Washington. And so one wonders how would our lives, how would history be different if Grandpa had gone to work for Booker instead of going to work for at Wilberforce? Well, one thing that would certainly have been different, he would not have met Nina. He met Nina at Wilberforce and fell in love. And as I said, they got engaged in 1895 and married in 1896. And to solve the mystery of these two rings, the ring on the left is in fact Nina's engagement ring, and the ring on the right is her wedding band. And if you look closely at the photograph, you can see they're counter beveled. One is beveled inside out and one is beveled outside in. They fit together as two pieces. And it's really quite fascinating to understand the love that they had for one another, and to see that love come to fruition in reality and then change and shift. And we will talk about that here in just a second. So that's a slightly different angle on the two rings. And so you can see the little engraving inside. If you could read the entire engraving, you would see that it says from W.E.B to NJD, and then the dates. He got engaged to Nina in May of 1895, and they got married in 1896. So Grandpa leaves Wilberforce at the request of some folks at the University of Pennsylvania. And he goes to the University of Pennsylvania because what is happening in the United States is Black people are moving out of the South, they're moving north, they're moving west, they're moving to other parts of the country. Well, they're moving to Philadelphia as well. And they're moving into an area that's called the 7th Ward. And the folks, one of the board of trustees and one of the original founders of the University of Pennsylvania, or part of that family, is curious because she lives in the 7th Ward and she wants to know who these people are. What are they about? Where do they come from? And so they commissioned Grandpa to do a work that's called the Philadelphia Negro. It's the first sociological study done on Black people in the United States. And the picture that you're looking at is a mural on the side of a fire station at 6th and South Street in Philadelphia. You can see Grandpa there on the left. The firemen on the right represent the all-Black fire station that was once a couple of blocks down the street and represented that community. And then the pictures in the middle represent the artist's depiction of the Philadelphia Negro and what Grandpa was doing to study the people there in the 7th Ward. He went out, if you look very closely at that picture, there's a red figure in the middle of a man in a top hat and tails. He went around and he interviewed all of the Black families in the 7th Ward. No, I did not stutter. I said all of the Black families in the 7th Ward, and he did most of it in a top hat and tails. He became well known in the community, obviously. One of the things that I would also mention about this particular mural is for those of you who are of a certain age, you will remember a thing called paint by numbers. And this was done in that way. The artist put the frame of the picture on and he invited community members to come in and fill in the color. This is a short quote from the Philadelphia Negroes, published in 1899. One of the reasons I put this quote up is because it reflects what we would now call the social determinants of health, which is the area that one of the areas that I work in. We talk about what is the environment that someone is growing up in? What is their surrounding custom culture? What are some of the ways that they work and speak to one another and interact and engage? Because it is that really describes our social milieu, and it is that social milieu that has a powerful, as Grandpa says, powerful impact on our social development, as well as the development of our health. Grandpa didn't know, Kiantha, back in 1899, that we would be talking about social determinants of health as much as we are today. But he did foresee that these things would impact us and impact our health as individuals. Grandpa did not get a lot of support from the University of Pennsylvania when he was there writing the Philadelphia Negro. He did not have an office. He did not have an assistant that was being paid by the university. He wasn't recognized. He didn't have a title. He didn't have a position of any kind. And the University of Pennsylvania attempted to ameliorate that oversight in 2012 by giving Grandpa an honorary emeritus professorship in sociology and Africana studies. Grandpa leaves Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania, goes to Atlanta University, and he starts the first sociology department in the United States. So one of the things that we know about history is that history is written by the victors, if you will. And so history had been rewritten around sociology to say that the University of Chicago folks actually created the first sociology department, in the United States, but it was actually W.E.B. DuBois at the University of Atlanta. And if you want to read a little bit more in depth about this, there is a good book out there called A Scholar Denied. And it's written by a PhD, and his name is right on the tip of my tongue. It'll come out somewhere here in the rest of my conversation with you. But he's out of Northwestern University. So Scholar Denied is an excellent piece of work that talks about Grandpa's influence in the field of sociology and his beginnings in the Atlanta conferences. I went to Atlanta in 2013. The folks there were interested in having some conversations about Grandpa, and so I went to do some of that, some presentations. They unveiled a bust of Grandpa in one of the sections of the university, and I had the opportunity to spend some time working with some of the scholars there. This is a photograph of me with the bust. The gentleman on the right is a true DuBois scholar. His name is Dr. Rayland Rabaka, and Dr. Rabaka is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at CU Boulder, the University of Colorado, just up the road from me. And he's there in the photograph because he and I developed a great brotherhood in the times that we spent together here at Clark Atlanta. So as I mentioned, Grandpa marries in 1896, and they have a child in 1898. You see in the middle of the screen Burkhart DuBois, and you also see for the first time Nina. And I have to say that my experience with seeing Nina's photograph in the first time that I saw it, I recall very clearly, she just took my breath away. And so she is absolutely beautiful, and I understand why my grandpa chose her from that perspective, because the story goes that he had two lists. He had two lists of women. One list said women who are beautiful. And if this was a live audience, I would tease you for a little while and try to get you to guess what the other list was. But since it isn't, I'll have to give it away. The second list was women who could cook, and Nina was on both lists. So you can imagine from that time frame, there were a lot of different things that were different than they are now, different from the way we perceive things today. One of the things that's important to note about this photograph is that it is one in which they as a family are happy and are looking forward to their future. Unfortunately, this photograph is bittersweet. The little boy that you see in the photograph there dies at 18 months old from diphtheria, and he dies because the Black doctor does not have the medicine to treat him, and the white doctor who does have the medicine will not treat him because he is Black. And this is the South. This is Atlanta. So he passes away in 1898. Burkhart is buried in Mowaway Cemetery in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, beside his mother, who dies in 1950. And he is also buried beside his sister, Yolande, who dies in 1961. So this is a photograph of Yolande. I'm here, so you have to understand that Grandpa had another child, and Yolande was born in 1900. One of the things that's a mystery to me, and I'll absolutely ask my grandparents about, is this concept that they kept recycling names. So Nina Yolande is obviously named after her mom. And then later, my mother is named Yolande DuBois. And so they recycled that name, Yolande. And then my mother names my older sister Nina. So there are 3 Ninas in my family and 2 Yolandes. And yeah, I guess we could have been a little bit more inventive on the name side. Grandpa does some other things in 1900 and onward. The death of Burkhart is a turning point for him, as is some other things that happened around the same time. But one of the things that is important to take note of is this Paris exposition. He takes materials from these different universities and he goes to this Paris exposition and shows the people in Europe what Black people are like here in the United States. He has a clear picture of what they perceive us to be like because he spent those 2 years at the University of Berlin. So he goes to try to disabuse them of some of the myths that they had about Black people during that time frame. The photograph you see is Grandpa at 35. The importance of him at 35 years old is because the year is 1903. And 1903 is the year in which The Souls of Black Folk is published. Souls of Black Folk is a series of essays, many of which were published before they were published together in Souls. And so you get the opportunity by having them all in one place to see some years of his thought around various different issues. Kiantha, you and I were talking earlier about what is the impact of Souls? What is the meaning of this book? What is the message that comes from 1903 to us today? And I think the message is broad. Number one, you can look at the chapter of the passing of the firstborn and understand the depth of the grief that my great-grandfather and his wife went through at the death of Burkhart, and put into context then the grief of so many slave mothers and fathers during the hundreds of years of slavery in this country. He speaks about his grief. And what I hear is the grief of all Black people who have lost a child who has maybe been snatched from their arms because of death, or snatched from their arms because a master wanted to take that body and use it somewhere else or trade it for someone else. What you see at the beginning of the chapters, as I mentioned earlier, is some words, often poetry, often music, and some bars of music that reflect back to those slave times. This is his handwriting. The last chapter is called The Sorrow Songs.
Can I ask a question really quickly
Sure.
before you move on?
Absolutely.
Because you mentioned something that I think is really relevant to today. So you mentioned that Bernhardt passed because he did not have access to the medication that was needed. And it immediately triggered me to think about post this opioid crisis, many African Americans and other people of color were not able to get proper medication. They were not able to get proper pain medication because they could not get it prescribed to them as Black people based on the impact of the opioid crisis, although that did not start in the Black community. So how do you think that is similar to what they experienced with not being able to get treatment for Bernhardt during that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think Burkhart's death really reflects this whole picture that we see as it relates to medicine in the United States and medicine historically as it relates to Black people not being treated appropriately, not being treated accurately, not being given opportunities for appropriate, not just medications, but even going back to how are we given tests to find out what is actually wrong with us? How are we perceived by folks when we walk in the door? How do we perceive the system? Because clearly there are ways in which Black people have been utilized in the system of medicine over time that have been inappropriate and that have been not just horrific, but in fact ways that we have been treated that have sunk into our soul and sunk into our bodies and sunk into the ways that we then perceive the medical community and the way that they can help us. So we may not even go for help because we are afraid or concerned that the medical community will not treat us well. There's a great book out there, is written by Harriet Washington, and it's called Medical Apartheid. And she talks about not just the Tuskegee experiments, but all of the different ways in which Black people have been utilized within the medical community. And you will walk away from reading her book, not just horrified, but understanding why Black people were so afraid and why they remain so afraid of the medical community.
So that might be an interesting read for us to suggest right now, because
Sure.
people are in the midst of the aftermath of the onset of the pandemic. Lots of people were concerned about why there were why there was hesitation in communities of color to access the vaccination. And so I
Absolutely.
think us going back and doing a bit of homework on what was being said at that time, and then comparing that to what might still be relative today, might answer some questions around hesitation for people.
Yeah, I think all the work that is done in that time frame is relevant to what we're talking about, because it does form the foundations of that multi-generational story that is passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, from aunt to nephew. It is one of those things that we have carried with us. This picture that you see on the screen is of a group of men who formed the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement was called the Niagara Movement because they had to meet in Niagara Falls, Canada. They were not allowed to meet on the United States side in 1905. So they met in Canada, and they pointedly met in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia for their second meeting. Obviously, the location of the famous slave insurrection led by John Brown. The founding of the NAACP comes directly from the work that was done in the Niagara Movement.
Now, before you move on from that, there's something else I want to make sure that we understand. Go back one slide, because I want to make sure that everyone sees this piece. So yes, there were 29 Blacks who joined, but what did they join? 3 whites. 3 whites who were also at the table. And I think that this helps us to understand why in our movement, even today in 2021, we cannot move forward as an organization, as a national organization, nor doing international work without the support of whites. Now, we need a few more than 3, but we do need the support. We need the support because it has to happen in tandem with the work that communities of color are doing. We have to have it. It's always been there, and it should always be there, to my way of understanding.
And we'll talk in just a couple of slides a little bit more about how that impacted that collaboration between Blacks and whites impacted the NAACP. The NAACP was not the NAACP in 1909. It was the National Negro Committee, and they changed their name in 1910 to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP was founded around this platform that you can't read because it is too small, but suffice to say, there were many different issues, the most important of which was anti-lynching. And so what I want you to understand about the NAACP through Grandpa's eyes was it was an experiment. It was something that they did not know would work. They did not know that it would last all these years. They did not know that by doing it, they would influence everything about the way the United States perceived race and proceeded to understand race and racism. But it was clear that they felt very compelled to do this work. The compelled came from these things that were going on in our nation. Dallas lynching in 1910. This is the lynching of a woman in Okemah in Oklahoma. She is lynched on a bridge. She is the figure on the right. The figure on the left that is hanging from the bridge is her son, who was lynched before her. This is a lynching in Georgia. Lest you believe that lynchings in this country were only done on Black people, this is the lynching of Leo Frank. If any of you have heard of an organization called the Anti-Defamation League, the Anti-Defamation League was started in response to the lynching of Leo Frank in Marietta, Georgia.
That brings up another point also, that there are clear defining moments in history that show that there is treatment that has been reserved for African Americans only.
Yes.
And that is sometimes hard for people to understand and wrap their minds around, because we can live in this universe together, but be on parallel planes. And so that is one of the things that I think is so critical, that we consider there are certain truths that belong to certain people. And it may not be the shared experience of everyone. That does not mean that it's not reality, or that it has not been part of what has impacted how we are socialized together.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that I like to disabuse folks of when they think about the myths related to lynching is that lynching was something that happened in the South, and it only happened in the South. It happened in, this is Duluth, Minnesota. And so it happened in the North as well. The intimidation, the rage that was unleashed by white mobs on Black bodies. And it's also clear that it was a generational thing that was passed. So you can see these little girls being taught the terror, being taught how to terrorize other people, and learning that they could have this kind of impact on the life of an individual.
When I see this picture, Arthur,
Mm-hmm.
it really calls to mind for me the responsibility that white women have,
Mm-hmm.
the responsibility that white women have to helping to dismantle racism,
Absolutely.
to be actively anti-racist, because you have a role in this.
Yes.
There is a role. You don't hear many stories of women, white women lynching people of color. You don't hear about that, but you
Right.
see that they were
Right.
present.
Exactly.
They were present. It is a piece of their history as well. And so the onus also falls on them to help to reverse the impact of these horrific things that happen to us.
I couldn't agree more. I completely agree with you. So there's a little bit about the NAACP. We know quite a bit about them. Their founding in 1909, the reasons, some of the things that they've done in the past. We'll talk a little bit more about Brown versus Board of Education here, some dear friends in the Little Rock 9 group, and many of the things that the NAACP has done to at least get people to acknowledge that we as African Americans have a story to tell, that we have a part in the building of this country, that we have a stake in what this country is about and what it means. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the co-founders of the NAACP, as we've talked about, but here are some of the other co-founders of the NAACP to speak to the issue that you were mentioning earlier, Kiantha, about the need for us to partner with other people. We needed to partner with white people. We needed to partner with the socialists who existed then in the United States, and particularly in New York City. We needed to partner with some of the deeper pockets, the economic power that white people had in order to form the NAACP. And we needed to bring the voice of Black women to this table, to this conversation, in the form of women like Ida B. Wells. Cover of the first 1910 Crisis magazine. Again, questions that I have for my great-grandfather, this is another one of them. Why this little boy? Why this picture of this little boy with the game that he has in his hand? For those of you who have not seen the game played, he has a hoop in his left hand, he has a stick in his right hand, and the game is to roll the stick along the ground, roll the hoop along the ground only using the stick. Who can go the furthest? Grandpa was involved in a lot of things, and in the era around 1900, he became involved with the Pan-African Congresses. So you can see there the years that Pan-African Congresses were held. They took a hiatus around the Second World War. But it is these conferences and the work that he was doing that helped to lead towards the formation of the Organization of African Unity, and then on to the actual decolonization of some of these nations. Kwame Nkrumah's name will come up later for us. Jomo Kenyatta, who became the first president of Kenya. The name Paul Robeson will come up again for us. And for those of you reading this list carefully, you will see there is a Wells on the list. And the Wells is H.G. Wells, the writer of such science fiction books that at least I grew up with as a child. Here's a photograph of the 1921 Pan-African Congress. Grandpa is right there in the middle with the papers in his hands. You can see that there are white people and Black people and people from Africa, people from all over Europe as part of this work. In 1920, he receives the Spingarn Medal. The Spingarn Medal is named after two brothers who were part of the founding of the NAACP as well. If you really want to get a fascinating education about African-American history, go to Wikipedia and look up the Spingarn Medal. It shows links to the many people who have won the Spingarn Medal over time. It reads like a who's who of African-American history. Grandpa has a run-in with Marcus Garvey. At first, they seem to get along fairly well, and then Grandpa and Marcus rub each other the wrong way, and they say some ugly things to one another and about one another that lead to a number of disagreements. Marcus Garvey being the founder of the group that was looking for Black people to return to Africa. He had a Back to Africa movement. He was also part of a Pan-African movement. And it is in this Pan-Africanist perspective that we still see some of the disagreement between Garvey and Du Bois. I had the opportunity a few years ago to meet with Garvey's son, Julius, at the United Nations, and apologize to him on behalf of my family for the things that my grandfather said about his father and about his family. And Julius, in his graciousness, apologized for the responses that his family had given to my family. And so hopefully at some level, we in this modern time have started the healing that it takes in the Pan-Africanist movement for us to move forward and achieve some of the things that both Marcus as well as my great-grandfather hoped to achieve.
The reality, though, is that we, even today, even in 2021, there are multiple ways of actualizing leadership, multiple ways. And so there are folks who might be on one end of a spectrum and choose to have a certain set of beliefs, and then folks on another side that may have this a different set of beliefs, but both entities are working in partnership to better the community that they're supporting. And so I think one thing that we learned from the conflict that was there between Garvey and Du Bois was that there is room for all. Both can exist, multiple layers can exist, and there has to be some reckoning that will happen at some time. And I think you're going to talk about the reckoning that sort of happened between the two of them and how they ended up working towards some shared goals together. So I think that's all stuff that we can learn from the past on how to move forward if we just look at the reality of what happened and how things happen. Nothing is new.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for the controversies between Garvey and Du Bois, as well as between Washington and Du Bois. I think when we look back from the vantage point that we have now, we can see that there is value in the things that Du Bois was saying. There's value in what Washington was saying. There's value in what Garvey was saying. And even though they might not have agreed with one another at the time, the value comes forward. It comes forward to us, and it comes forward to the work that we are doing today. I want to put some personal spin on some of what's going on in Grandpa's life during this time too. His only daughter gets married. I love showing this kind of picture to young people, elementary school children who look at the dresses and they just marvel. This is the Roaring 20s. It's 1928, and the event of Yolande's wedding is one of the largest events in the Harlem Renaissance period, which had started in 1920.
Go back. I want to stop.
I'm never going to get through this slideshow.
I know, I'm trying my best, but listen, this is yet another example of the diverse experiences of people of color.
Yes.
The diverse experiences of Black folks.
Yes.
Not everyone grew up and lived in a place of poverty, from a place of poverty. That was not everyone's experience.
Yes.
And for some it was. So we have to know that just as there were different social economic influences on the lives of Black people then, that exists today.
Yes.
And that does not mean that those two extremes, if you want to say, that those extremes cannot come together for the good of the Black whole.
So what you say is interesting, and what it provokes in my mind is When Grandpa went to Paris in 1900 and he takes that exposition of what's going on, what he takes is a lot of photographs and materials about what Black people were like. They were landowners, they were mayors, they were city council people, they ran things, they had whole towns that were African American and that were thriving. And we know this because we can look at the Tulsa issues, we can look at the things that where towns were burned to the ground and things were destroyed, and Blacks' economic power was taken away from them, and they were intimidated into being second-class citizens once again post-slavery, right? So the reason that I raise that is because when we talk about reparations in this country, when we have the conversation about what does it take to put Black people back into the position that was stolen from them, into the positions that they achieved on their own merits, we can talk about what they look like by looking at what Grandpa presented in 1900, by seeing photographs like this of Yolande's wedding, by seeing some of the different ways in which Black people controlled their own destiny at different points in the history of this country, and how that was changed, how that was stolen, how that was taken from them, and the ways that it was taken. And then put a dollar figure to that, put real change to that, to put it right, to make reparation. And that is a huge, huge conversation that comes out of the things that you're talking about.
Absolutely. So there's a question. We have asked individuals who are streaming this show live and are able to participate in our conversation to please include questions that they'd like to be asked of you. And this question, I think, is really critical. It's not of this photo, so I think we'd have to go back a few, but the picture of W.E.B. Du Bois' father, that appeared to be a Confederate uniform. So our
he was a Union soldier.
Thank you.
Yes, he was a Union soldier. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, if I didn't make that clear, he was a Union soldier.
Very good.
So that's Yolande's wedding, bridesmaids. There has to be a groom. The groom was County Cullen. She married County, and of course, when there was bridesmaids, there were groomsmen. And so County invited some of his friends to be groomsmen and to be a part of the wedding on his side. And so if you don't know those names, Google them. Of all of them, Langston Hughes is my penultimate favorite, but as I mentioned, Paul Robeson would come to the table again, and Paul and Grandpa were dear friends, and I'll show you a picture of that friendship a little later. And if you don't know Paul Robeson, you really do need to study that one. Grandpa goes on in 1935 to write a book called Black Reconstruction. He takes the Reconstruction period and looks at it from a Marxist perspective, and he really talks about what is the economic evolution of Black people in this country. And if any quote of Grandpa's sticks in your mind, this one should, in terms of what does a civilized standard of living look like today, and how do we assure that Black people have a civilized standard of living today? Larger question. This is the cover of Black Reconstruction, published in 1935. Grandpa leaves the NAACP in 1934. He goes back to Atlanta University. Sorry for the poor picture, but this is a photograph of the cover of Phylon magazine from 1945. He starts this magazine that is, as it says, a review of race and culture at Atlanta University in 1945. When I went to Atlanta University, they asked me, they were pleading with me, please, please, please don't forget Phylon, because it represents such an important evolution of thinking, scientific and educational thinking about what race and culture really looked like starting around 1945 and going forward. Three amazing and powerful people in one photograph. On the left, Mary McLeod Bethune, after whom Bethune-Cookman is named, and on the right, Horace Mann Bond. And if the name Bond sounds familiar to you and it's not James Bond, it should be the head of a family that had a great influence on the city of Atlanta. Great educators. Here's, as promised, a picture of Grandpa with Paul Robeson. They met at the League of Nations. The story that I'm told is the two of them are on different sides of a very crowded room, and they weave through the crowds to one another, and the moment of their meeting is captured in this photograph. As I mentioned, Grandpa's wife dies in 1950. The woman that you see on the right side of the picture to his left is Shirley Graham. And Shirley actually becomes Grandpa's second wife. This is a photograph of Grandpa engaged with folks at the Peace Information Center, which he helped to found, which is a group that was trying to denuclearize the planet, get rid of nuclear weapons. Because of his work with different governments to do that, he was perceived as an enemy of the state and he was thrown in jail. And if you can do the math, 1951, he was born in 1868, he was in his 80s at this point. And it is clear that they are persecuting him because of his friendship with some folks who you'll see pictures of here in a moment. Interestingly enough, one of the people who came to his defense was a man by the name of Albert Einstein. Shirley and Grandpa get married, and I think it was Valentine's Day of 1952, as it turns out. And there are some wonderful pictures from their wedding. They get married and in a small ceremony at their home in Brooklyn. You might note from this photograph that Shirley appears to be a great deal younger than Grandpa, and she is. She's 20 plus years younger than my grandfather. And the fun family story that is told is that Grandpa slept in Shirley's bed when she was a teenager. And of course, the backstory to that makes it seem a little less strange is that Grandpa would go around the country giving speeches in support of the NAACP chapters around the country. And he was invited to Colorado Springs to give a talk. And the pastor who invited him, of course, to stay in his home because Black people could not stay in hotels in those days. And the custom was to give the honored guest the best bedroom in the house aside from the master's bedroom. And that bedroom was Shirley's bedroom. She was the oldest daughter of that family. And so Grandpa slept in Shirley's bedroom. And of course, her father and Shirley were huge fans of Grandpa's. I promised a conversation about Brown versus Board of Education, but in the interest of time, I won't delve into this too deeply. Obviously, Brown was to fight the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate is equal. It was a unanimous decision that separate is not equal. The second Brown versus Board of Education decision passed in 55 said separate to desegregate schools with all deliberate speed. In 78, they went on to say these are some of the things that needed to be done. And although they declared that this problem was solved in 1999 with the unified status, we of course know now today that schools in this country are more segregated now in 2021 than they were in 1954. I mentioned this.
Certainly attest to that. But growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I often tell people that Milwaukee is actually the #1 most segregated city in this state right now. For many years, it was #2, but even today in 2021, it's #1. So segregation most definitely still exists in communities, in education environments, and certainly in workplaces as well.
I would encourage folks to take a look at the social scientist statement, which is the bullet in the middle of that screen. It's an amicus brief that was presented by a group of social scientists to the 1954 decision that talked about how desegregation should be done in order for it to be successful. And if you go back and you read that, you can then you make your own opinion about how well desegregation was actually implemented in the United States. And then you perhaps will not be so surprised at its failure. It's a photograph that I put into my presentation just a couple of presentations ago. On the left is my mother. In the middle, of course, is W.E.B. Du Bois. And on the right is Du Bois's daughter, Yolande. And in Du Bois's arms is a little me.
Oh.
So that is a photograph of our 4 generations of our family. As is the custom often enough in old photographs like this, my father is behind the camera taking this picture. And there is another picture in which my mother and father switch places, in which my father is holding me and Grandpa is in the middle and Yolande is in the photograph. So Grandpa, let's see here. The lead into this picture is that because of the work with the Peace Information Center, they take Grandpa's passport. And so he is not given his passport back until 59. He is awarded the Lenin Peace Prize in the interim between 51 and 59. And he goes, when his passport is returned to him, he goes to what was then the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, to receive the Lenin Peace Prize. And as the caption above notes, that is Nikita Khrushchev on the right, and that is Shirley on the left. And the little face that you see peeking from behind Grandpa is the translator. He wins the Lenin Peace Prize from the USSR. Because he's in the neighborhood, he goes to check out another friend, and that friend is Mao Zedong. And it is an interesting photograph that I've presented to you because I, like Shirley, writes a pictorial biography of Grandpa. Shirley is a brilliant woman in her own right, a brilliant writer, and she writes a pictorial biography about Grandpa. She asks the question, I asked the question, but she states in the statement about this picture that Chairman Mao and Grandpa were laughing like schoolboys. Now, the question that I ask is, what are two of the most serious, influential leaders in the history of the world laughing about? So I want to know. But there are tons of photographs of Chairman Mao and Grandpa together, and I love this one. This is another photograph that involves me. So you can see I was a chubby little baby in 1960. It is labeled the way it is because the little girl that you see sitting near my grandfather's knee is a woman by the name of Lorca Porres. Lorca is named after the Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca. And the woman whose hand is on her knee is her mom. Her mom is my mother's best friend. We were born 7 days apart. I was born on Christmas and Lorca was born on the 2nd of January. Woman came up to us and asked my mother, who had us swaddled in a carriage, pushed down the street, saying that she didn't know that my mother had twins. And so the little girl that you see there is my twin sister. Lorca is now an Elizabethan actress in New York, runs her o'n theater company, is 5'10", blonde and blue, and we couldn't look any different from one another.
I love it. You sound just like twins. So let me tell you, Arthur, we have about one or 2 minutes left before we get to the portion of our show where we want to give our audience an opportunity to ask some questions.
Super.
So I want us to get us through the ones that we must see.
So you must see this because you must know that I was cute once.
I think you look exactly the same.
Oh, thank you.
Exactly the same.
So this is a photograph. Grandpa is leaving the United States, as was mentioned earlier. His passport is being threatened once again in 1961. So he leaves the United States. This is Idlewild Field, which is now JFK Airport. And this is my favorite picture with me and my great-grandfather because I clearly feel safe with him with my hand on his hand, and he clearly adores me by the look in his eyes. Grandpa moves to Accra, Ghana, and this is Kwame Nkrumah, who is the first president of an independent Ghana. He goes at Kwame's request to write an Encyclopedia Africana, and this is 1963, which is also the year he dies. And this is a picture of Kwame Nkrumah and it's the Shirley Grant to the left, and the chiefs. The people that you see behind in African garb and even in suits are the chiefs from that area and from the country. He is given a state funeral. I go on to meet Kwame Nkrumah's daughter, that is Samia Nkrumah, when I'm there in 2018 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Grandpa's birth. I'm invited by the United States government, by the Ghanaian government, and this group of expatriates, the African American Association in Ghana. There is a celebration that's given. The man standing at the dais is the ambassador to Ghana from the United States ambassador. The woman that you see in the middle of the picture on the dais is the head of tourism in Ghana, and the vice president is the gentleman to her right. And I got a chance to say a few words over my left shoulder, just to the right of me and the dais in that picture is the chief from this area. And I had the opportunity to speak with him. Maybe as part of the question and answer, I'll tell you that story. I go to the door of no return, which is go through the door of no return, which is where slaves often went at the dungeon. And the Ghanaians have since labeled it the door of return for African Americans. And so I came back through it as an African American returning to my homeland. I'll leave you with this quote. It is then the strife of all honorable men of the 20th century to see that in the future composition of races, the survival of the fittest shall mean the triumph of the good, the beautiful, and the true, that we may be able to preserve for future civilization all that is really fine and noble and strong, and not continue to put a premium on greed and impudence and cruelty. I acknowledge that many of these pictures came from the University of Massachusetts Amherst website and their archive and digitized versions of much of Grandpa's papers and his photographs. I celebrate the Association of African Americans in Ghana who continue to keep the life of W.E.B. Du Bois alive. He is buried there in Accra, and they continue to oversee the center where his body is held. Also, the remains of Shirley Graham are there. Shirley died in China. In fact, when Kwame Nkrumah is overthrown, she is there in Ghana. She moves first to Egypt to be with her son, and then she moves at the request of the Chinese government to Beijing. She dies there, and one of her last requests is that her remains be sent back to Ghana. And so there is an urn that contains her ashes sitting next to Grandpa. And my family always supports me in doing this work, and I couldn't do it without them. Here are some references if you would like to read a little bit more about what Grandpa's life was like, both from his own words as well as from those of Shirley Graham and David Levering Lewis, who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one for each of those biographies about Grandpa, which has never been done before. I'll stop there.
Take a breath.
Breathing is optional. Breathing is optional.
I'm telling you, this is exciting stuff. This is exciting stuff. And it is so beautiful to be able to see the relevance of everything that happened in your great-grandfather's life, to see the relevance in the work that we do at the NAACP nationally. And this is just, it's really special. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I appreciate you sharing those family memories with us, as well as some of the things that have been published about your grandfather. If there were something that you think your grandfather would want us to know in 2021, what might that be?
I perceive my grandfather, and this may be partly my own lens, but I perceive my grandfather as being a man who was very encouraging and he was demanding, there's no doubt about that, but he encouraged us to look forward, to move forward, to think in a forward fashion, to think about the future in many ways that are different than what we might think about them. I think he would be encouraging to us to think about the future. What have we learned? I think he would really, you talked about us as a community having responsibility. I think part of that responsibility is learning from these kinds of moments in history. We are in an inflection point in our history in the United States, but we've been here before. Yes. We were here in 1920. When we went through the Harlem Renaissance, we were here in 1910. We were here in 1895. We were here in 1868. We've had inflection points in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1990s. What have we learned from each of these past inflection points? And how do we apply that to what we are demanding as we go forward? Frederick Douglass told us that nothing yields, the country, the economic situation does not yield to us without a demand. What is the demand that we're making? How can we clarify that demand? And how can we assure ourselves that the thing that we're demanding now is going to get us closer to the goal that we've had at each of these inflection points in the past?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want you to come over to my house for dinner. This is crazy. You have to come over for dinner because I don't want to be done with this conversation. I don't want to be done. There's so much more. My last question for you before we turn it back over into the hands of our wonderful wonderful guest, our host, rather, Miss Lanisha DeBartolano. Before we get back to her, I want to ask you this. What is the number one way you feel your grandfather's work, his body of work, his life, his legacy, what is the number one way that it influences how you move every single day?
Confidence, in a word.
Confidence.
I know that one person can change the world. And I know that my voice, if I project my voice into the right spaces, in the right moment, with the right partners, I can make a difference in the world. I can lead groups of people towards the kind of outcomes, as I mentioned, these inflection points have been trying to achieve. The murder of George Floyd is an inflection point. I lived in that moment. I lived as a Black man in that country, in that world, and I am in a position in which I can have an influence over how we respond to that work. How do we respond to that incident? How do we respond to this inflection point? And I was given that by my great-grandfather, and that advice that he gave me when I was 3 months old. He said to do this work. I know that it takes courage. I know that there is pain and suffering in doing the work, but I still have him as an example to hold up and say, okay, let's do it, because it's important. It's important for us and it's important for our future.
I love that. I love confidence. That's probably what I hoped you'd say. And you didn't disappoint. So confidence is great. Now that leads me to another question. And then I have one more that's folks are sending online. And I want to get that through. Thank you for joining us and thank you for submitting your questions. My question is now, confidence being the thing that you would carry with you, that most impacts your work. What would you say to people who say, yeah, I have a little bit of confidence, but my great grandfather's not W.E.B. Du Bois, so I don't have that kind of confidence. What would you say to people to help them understand? Because I think this is a message that I share all the time. Every single person can make a difference. Every single person. There is no one sans the ability to change the world. No one. And so, yes, you have maybe a certain impetus by your ancestors, by who your great granddad was and the people who was around him. You have that. But even those of us who may not have any connection to, I would say, Black greatness in the way that your grandfather is revered, we still have an opportunity. And I think we have a responsibility to also try to change the world as well.
I think we all have a responsibility to be a part of making that change happen. Of course, we hear the quote from Mahatma Gandhi that says, be the change. Well, that's not what Gandhi said. He said, we must be the change we wish to see in the world. There is something in those two words about we must that really is the responsibility that we have to take on. Grandpa, I think in giving me that confidence, I would say to you quite honestly, if there was someone else who maybe had as much or more influence on my young life than my great-grandfather did, it was my friend Gil Scott-Heron. He had a song that talked about the C's, and he was talking about conspiracy and CIA and some things like that. But I would stick to that and say, in addition to confidence, you have to have courage. You just have to have the courage to fight for your convictions. You have to have the courage to fight for what you believe in. And what we believe in is a part and parcel of the soul that we carry with us. And if we're going to be true to that soul, the courage that we bring to these situations is probably one of the most important things we can bring besides that confidence.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. Okay, one of the questions that we have from someone who is participating in our show this afternoon is, can you tell us what were your grandfather's insights on Ghana and Africa, and tell us a little bit about his support of the Pan-Africanism movement?
So, I think what Grandpa saw, and it's one of the lessons I think I've learned, if you will, subliminally from him, is this idea of partnership, this idea of working in groups of people to force change, to bring about change. To be thought leaders is great. But until you actually link arms and walk shoulder to shoulder with people who are walking in the direction that you're walking, it is difficult to get traction. It's difficult to make change. It's difficult to demand the kinds of things that you know need to be demanded if you don't have partners who are standing beside you. So when I look at his time in the Pan-Africanist movement and the Pan-African Congresses and the travel that he did and the letters that he wrote and the things that he said, the speeches that he gave, the work that he did with the members of the Congresses that I had on the screen, as well as others, I think it really is that coalescing of a thought that freedom of these African spaces is something that has to happen. These lands were stolen from people who lived there before, and they have to be returned to them. They have to be decolonized. And so we see that the decolonization in Africa then brings about many, many changes. And we can talk for another hour or so about South Africa and Nelson Mandela and the work that was done there, and where that experiment in decolonization has taken us and what it has brought about in South Africa. We can talk about Nigeria, we can talk about Ghana, we can talk about Egypt, we can talk about Congo, we can talk about many nations in the African umbrella that really, to me, represent these opportunities for people of color, for Black people who lived there for thousands of years before white people came along, and talk about the changes that have been wrought, and talk about the ways in which we can continue to support how that decolonizing movement in that time has moved into today. 70 years later, or 63 years later, I was born in the same year that Ghana achieved independence. So almost 63 years ago.
Well, I will tell you this, we have a moment to take one additional audience question. And so if there is someone who has an additional question, we have just a second of time. I would love to be able to ask that question of our illustrious guests. I will say this, I want you to know, and I want you to know this from me and from my the centermost point of my heart, is that I am a better person as a result of our conversation today. I know more than I knew before we started talking, and I'm hoping that some of the people who tuned in today are also going to walk away from this conversation saying, yes, I learned more about W.E.B. Du Bois, but I also learned more about collaborating with community. I also learned more about making sure that we are looking at the disparities that exist in healthcare for people of color. I hope we're looking at how those things impact our world every single day. And so to me, again, I am better because of having the opportunity to meet you. And I hope that the people who are watching feel the same way. So our last question, it looks like, okay, what changes to activism today would you say Du Bois might have wanted to make?
Interesting question. Let me start by saying thank you for leading this conversation, Kiantha. It has been an honor to listen to you and to talk to you and have an opportunity to meet you and get to know you. I always learn from these encounters with people. I learn from the questions. I learn from the things that the questions provoke me to think about. In terms of this question, I think it's interesting to sort of hypothesize about what Grandpa might say to folks, because he pushed the boundaries so hard, because he pushed people's thinking so much, because he tried over his entire life by evolving through and into and about a lot of different ways to get the message out, to make the change happen. I would think that he would come to us and ask us the questions. And I'm quite frankly not sure what those questions really are because I'm not him, but I think he would ask us some tough questions about what we're trying to achieve, about what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it, about how we're working with one another or working against one another, about what sorts of things should we really put our shoulder to a little bit harder, with a little bit more force, with a little bit more emphasis, with a little bit more zeal to get some things done. What areas should we focus on? I mean, we clearly look at what Barack Obama did around the Affordable Care Act, focusing in on healthcare, focusing in on the issues related to that. Now we know the social determinants of health are 80% of our health. 20% is the clinical care that we get and the access to that clinical care. So what about beginning to address some of these other issues? When you look back at the platform that the Black Panther Party put together in the 60s, you see many of those same words, many of those same needs, many of those same social determinants playing themselves out in communities around the country. So how have we evolved? How have we changed? How far have we actually come in addressing some of the things that are meaningful? I think Grandpa would be asking us, what is meaningful today, and how are we going to go about addressing those issues more succinctly, more clearly, with specific goals? I'm an evaluator. I didn't talk much about the work that I do, but I do program evaluation, and we have things called SMART goals. SMART goals are designed to really focus us. We've since evolved into things called SMART T goals, i.e. on the end of SMART, where we look at inclusion and equity issues as we start to address the goals that we're after. I think we as a group of activists need to apply these different tools like SMARTy goals to what we're doing so that we're clear when we're making progress and clear when we are not.
Absolutely. Clear, I'm going to repeat that in case anybody in the back didn't hear it. Clear when we are making goals and clear when we are not. And that requires courage. Back to that. So thank you so much for being with us today. Again, my heart is full. My heart is full. So thank you. And thank you for your family. Thank them. Tell them Kiantha said, thank you for allowing you to share this space with us today. Lanisha?
Thank you so much, Mr. Arthur McFarlane II and Kiantha Duncan. Ms. Kiantha Duncan, what a thoughtful conversation. And only from a family member of DuBois could we hear such insightful, informative, and intimate glimpses into the life of W.E.B. Du Bois. Thank you so much, Mr. McFarlane, for sharing the photos, the reflections, and the call to actions. And Ms. Duncan, thank you. Your skillful framing of the conversation from start to finish enlightened us all about the broader story of history and Black activism. And so we thank you both for leading and sharing with us from the wellspring of wisdom that you all share. Thank you both. And we thank the NAACP for their partnership and for their continued commitment to equity and to Du Bois's original vision for the organization. We thank NAAM's staff and town hall, and we thank Hobbs Waters and Kayla Banks for the dance presentations. One final presentation is coming up. And to all of you, thank you for tuning in. We invite you all to come back to our next virtual Descendants Series conversation. It will be held on Sunday, October 17 at 3 p.m. here on NAAM's YouTube channel live, when we will be in conversation with Miss Tina Wyatt. She is the great-great-great-granddaughter of Harriet Tubman. And that conversation will be moderated by Miss Kiantha Duncan. We look forward to that conversation as well. So mark your calendars to be with us, October 17, 3 p.m. right here. There is something truly for everyone with the Northwest African American Museum. So be sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to us on our website, www.naamnw.org. Our three pillars at NAAM are to advance justice and equity, cultivate educational empowerment, and center and celebrate Black history, art, and culture. And we believe that we can change our community, our region, and the nation through anti-racist education, inclusive history, and the power of the Black arts. We will now receive a concluding encore dance presentation from dancer, artist, and entrepreneur based in Portland, Oregon, Hobbs Waters. He calls himself a dope teen who has been studying ballet since age 7, and his goal is to build a professional career as a ballet dancer. Kayla Banks is his choreography collaborator and sound editor, and she is a choreographer, dancer, and actor. She has trained with Northwest Dance Project, the Cleo Parker Robinson, and at the International Blacks in Dance Conference. Her focus is on wellness, technique, spirituality, and expression. Following his brief concluding performance will be concluding remarks by Tracy Flood, President of the Bremerton NAACP, and Jonathan Johnson, President of the Tacoma NAACP. So again, we thank you all for tuning in. We salute Ms. Kiantha Duncan and Mr. Arthur McFarlane II for this riveting conversation. Enjoy the rest of your evening. We'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Greetings. I am Tracy Flood, President of the NAACP Bremerton Branch Unit 1134. It is my honor to bring you greetings from the Kitsap Peninsula for today's program. The NAACP is the oldest civil rights organization around, doing work in response to race riots in 1909. The work continues today, from the classrooms to the courtrooms. We see the need. From the work on the lines of education, criminal justice, climate change, voting rights, workers' rights, healthcare, the NAACP's work is still relevant today. We continue to fight for policy changes in every aspect of these areas and more, especially for our young people. Today's program is very important, and it highlights the relevance that continues for the work in which the NAACP was established, and we invite you to continue. Thank you.
On behalf of the Executive Committee and members of the Tacoma Branch NAACP, I'm delighted to offer greetings to the Northwest African American Museum. President DeBartleman, Alaska, Oregon, Washington State Area Conference President, NAACP Hankerson, my NAACP colleagues, esteemed guest Arthur McFarlane II, and moderator, Spokane Branch President Kiantha Duncan. My name is Jonathan Johnson, President of Tacoma Branch NAACP. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is one of the living legacies of Dr. William Edward Burghardt DuBois. I'm reminded of the anticipation and excitement I experienced in Oklahoma City when my family awaited to hear from our family historian, author, and storyteller of a great oral tradition we cherish to this day. We didn't know what to expect, but we knew we were in for a colorful rendition, painted on the canvas of our minds, words and emotion describing where we'd come from, who we are, and where we're going, God willing. Although we are all not connected by blood today, the broader family of the NAACP invited guests, friends, to hear from a perspective that only family can provide. It is with the same reverence and respect for family that I offer greetings from the Tacoma NAACP branch of this great family.